Mr. Speaker, welcome on program and thank you so much for your time and for your. I hope you have a nice visit in Georgia and Armenia, in this region. First of all, let's talk about this visit and let's talk about your expressions about this visit. I mean, why the Caucasus region is interesting for Sweden and what is this important of this region for the Swedish government? I mean.
Well, this is an unusual high-level visit that we make. So with me I have the 3 deputy speakers and the group leaders for the party groups in Parliament. So we only travel together in this format once every 4-year parliamentary term, and we wanted to come here to demonstrate Sweden's support for democracy, democratic development, democratic consolidation in Georgia and previously this week in Armenia. We think it's tremendously important to strengthen democracy and democratic institutions and all that we think is connected to democracy, such as human rights, minority rights, women's rights, rule of law, free and fair elections, and all of that. So that is of great interest to us, and Georgia is a part of Europe, and we want all of Europe to flourish and to be democratic.
And how do you feel about democracy in this country if you have this kind of talks about this issue with, and I'm sure you had with our officials?
Well, Georgia is a democracy and has been for several years, and we know that there are plans for electoral reform, a proportional election system, and we welcome that announcement since it provides an opportunity for all parties to come together and discuss and also to have discussions with the civil society and on how to implement this reform in the best possible way. So I feel optimistic, but there are of course obstacles and challenges, and one of them that I'm concerned about is the high degree of confrontation in Georgian politics. We have a tradition in Sweden to only, for instance, change the constitution only when there is broad consensus. We have a great day-to-day working relationship between, I would say, all members of parliament, that if you are a representative of another party, you're not an enemy, you are a colleague, you are also an elected representative of the Swedish people, so that you have to be able to separate the person from the principle and work together, although you may have different ideologies. And I hope that I have been able to describe this to our Georgian friends, and that may be a process evolving in that direction also here.
So it's definitely a very serious challenge for Georgian democracy. I mean, this kind of polarization, yeah, definitely this is. As much as you are celebrating 100 years of democracy, the main topic of our talk and main topic of our conversation is democracy at all. And let's first start from the very beginning and from the very describing the term. How much do you agree with the assessment that democracy right now, today, contemporary democracy, has kind of crisis period, and this is the crisis of democracy what we are observing, especially in Europe or in the United States, I mean the Western part of the world?
I wouldn't say that there is a crisis. I wouldn't use such a word. I would say there are challenges. There are challenges within our communities that with some examples of rising internal extremism. We see in the world that authoritarian regimes are gaining strength and self-confidence and challenging the democratic way of running countries, and both of those trends are problematic, but that doesn't constitute a crisis. I think the democracies of Europe and other parts of the world in general stand strong in the world, and but we do have to stick together as democracies and challenge the narratives of authoritarian regimes or extremist groups of extremists, and describe and to our populations why democracy is the best way of running a country and why all other options are worse.
So one of the reasons for the uprising of the extremism was the kind of so-called migration crisis, and this is still the serious issue on the table inside the EU, as I know. And what is your vision about this problem? I mean, how could Europe solve the issue of the migration, which is kind of serious problem in terms of democracy, because uprise of extremism is kind of fear of unknown people, fear of migration or something like that, which is kind of contraring the democracy by itself. I mean, the spirit of democracy. I mean, with this openness and giving the opportunity to other people of come in and kind of participate in the processes and so on. What is your country's vision about this problem?
Well, I would say that it is important that the European Union tries to find a common migration policy so that this situation can be handled by all the countries of the European Union together. But that is we can't be sure that that will happen. So that also means that every country has to address this issue and take responsibility for the situation. And I think that many countries have work to do when it comes to integration. I think that it's a problem when people coming from other countries are living in marginalized suburbs, for instance, which is the case in several European countries, to some extent also Sweden. And we have to, I think, in many countries do much more to integrate them into our societies, to create job opportunities, education and language training and many other things, so that they are part of the society and not perceived as an external problem, but they are part of the society and contribute in the build-up of and development of the societies of Europe.
How much you feel that European society, they are open for these kind of approaches? I mean, for giving them an opportunity to come for work or something like that. I mean, because I don't know how much in Sweden, but all around Europe there are a lot of problems, and people are voting for the populists, especially because of the migration issues. I mean, this kind of job loss or unemployment issues and something like that, which is kindly more or less tied with the migration processes.
Well, first I would like to stress that the Speaker of the Swedish Parliament is supposed to be party politically neutral, which means that I can't deliberate too much on things that are controversial in the Swedish context, where the parties have different opinions. So what I just stated about integration and the need for integration, I think all parties in Sweden would agree upon. Then they would have, I think, very different measures on how to bring about integration. So that's why I discussed on a more general level. I would say my impression is that there is an understanding throughout Europe that we need more of integration. I would like to stress also that I don't think that the migration issue is the only reason for the rise of populism in Europe. I think there are many other things, that some members of our societies feel disenfranchised, that there is a divide often between the countryside and the major cities, and that people feel that politicians don't listen to them, and all of those are serious aspects of this situation, and we have to address them seriously.
So that's what you touched already, and I would like to ask you about that. I mean, the uprise of populism, and let's call it not just the populism, but the individuals or individual leaders, which became very popular inside the societies rather than the institutions, or rather than the let's say so the party elites or something like that. Yes, I mean, these leaders became more popular and individuals became more popular than the parties or groups and so on and so on. What is the reason for that? I mean, because this is really crucial for democracy. Democracy is based on institutions and based on the party process policies and so on. But when we are observing right now the uprise of these political individuals, I mean, we have right now the Boris Johnson in Britain, we have, I mean, Salvini in Italy, and a lot of people like that, I mean, which are very popular inside the societies, and society are following these leaders rather than the ideas of the political movements and so on. What was the reason for that? And how much it has the reflections inside the Sweden?
first I would like to say that I think it's hard to compare different political leaders. I think there are huge differences between, for instance, Boris Johnson and Salvini in Italy. So I think it's hard to describe them on the same page of a book. But and I would also like to say that in Sweden, I wouldn't say we have that trend. In Sweden, in general, we have always had the tendency that people vote more for party than for person, and we haven't really had this emergence of very strong and popular leaders in the sense that you describe, and so I can't really relate personally to this situation, but I know that internationally there are some examples of that kind, and I would just say that I think it's important that political movements are based on ideology, on principle, and not just centered around a charismatic person, because if you want to solve problems in a strategic and coherent manner, I think you have to have some kind of structure, some kind of basic ideas from which you derive your various solutions. Otherwise, I think it's easy for the policies to be ad hoc and unstructured. But that is a very general observation, really.
And why that happened? Why the people has this kind of gap between the political elites and traditional elites, traditional political parties? I'm not talking about right now about Sweden. I mean, in Europe, this is kind of trend that people are having this kind of, especially when we are observing then the last elections inside the European Parliament. I mean, this uprising of the, let's call them the populist parties or populist leaders, and their achievements through the Europe. What was the reason for this kind of gap between the society and the political elite?
Well, I would say that, as I mentioned before, there are some groups in our societies who feel that the increased wealth, the economic growth is not for them, that they don't feel that they are part of society or that they are heard. Nobody listens to them, they feel, and that of course means I think that they search for other people to speak for them, and I think that might be one reason for the rise of those parties and movements which you describe, and I think that is a very serious lesson for all parties, really, to be that it is so important to listen to people and to address the real issues of everyday life rather than artificial conflicts between parties and politicians. I think in order to gain trust in the electorate, you need to address the issues that people really care about, that they discuss at their kitchen table. And I don't think that has always been the case in some countries in Europe.
Do you feel optimistic about this issue?
I do, absolutely. I'm an optimist. I was born an optimist and I will remain an optimist. I think that it's obvious that democracy and democratic countries have created so much more freedom, wealth, happiness than countries governed in other ways, so that it's so obvious to me that democracy is the way of governing that the future will show, that history has shown is the most successful, and that will continue into the future.
You mentioned about the wealth which is spread all over the society, and which was the leakage of the wealth, spreading of the wealth was one of the reasons for this kind of gap between the society and the elites. What is the Swedish experience regarding that? Is it still really very much based on the welfare state?
Oh, absolutely. I would say My interpretation is that there is no major political conflict regarding the welfare state. Nobody really advocates another social system. We have tax-financed healthcare, nobody questions that. We have tax-financed childcare, schools, universities, and that has unanimous political support. Then there are political differences on how to manage this and some other things and how to develop it and so on. But I would say that that has solid support in Sweden, both in politics and in the population as such. So, absolutely.
How much democracy is based on the welfare?
Well, I think that it is important that, I mean, many people say that, and there is research, I believe, to support it, that if you have very big economic differences within a society, it is more difficult to hold it together. We have in Sweden, of course, economic differences between people, but if you compare internationally, Sweden is one of the countries with very small, relatively very small differences. That is, of course, an issue of political controversy on how big this difference should be, how high taxes we should have, how much social contributions and so on. But in general, I would say that that is the case, and I think it's easier to hold a society together if you have, if you don't have a lot of poor people, and if you have
From your personal perspective, what is the main challenges from the Swedish 100-year-old democracy today?
Well, as I mentioned, the Swedish democracy, I would say, in general, is very stable, and our democratic institutions are stable. We have a very high voter participation rate. We had parliamentary elections in September last year, and then 87% of the electorate participated, which internationally is a very high figure. We are, according to an international index, the third most democratic country in the world, and so it's strong. But of course, there are challenges. I mentioned the rise of extremism. We have extremist groups also in Sweden of various kinds. I would also say that the rise of authoritarianism in our neighborhood is a problem, and in our neighborhood, by that I mean the closest surroundings of the European Union. And there are also challenges in some countries inside the European Union where we are concerned about the development of the protection for the rule of law, for instance, in some countries. And so I would say that those are important challenges, but that the Swedish democracy is strong.
So finally, I would like to ask you about that. Sweden could not be the only democracy. It needs the democratic partners around. And I'd just like to ask you about your feelings about the solving or answering these kind of challenges inside the European Union. I mean, I ask that because Georgia's aspirations to become the member of this family, European family, that means to understand what kind of process is happening there and what kind of participation can we take inside this process or something like that. So in that regard, you already mentioned that you are optimistic about the issues, but concretely, what could happen? What could be the steps to solve the challenges that we are talking right now from the European perspective?
Well, first I would like to stress that Sweden is a staunch supporter of Georgia's European ambitions, and we welcome Georgia's ambitions to integrate more with the European Union and to step by step come closer and closer to the European Union. I mean, Georgia is a European country, and Tbilisi is a European capital, and it is so important that we that the member states of the European Union remembers that, and that we have a continuous integration between the EU and Georgia. And what can the European Union do to solve the problems we discussed? Well, I would say that that is an issue both for the Union as such and for the various member states. I mean, many tools in social policy, for instance, in education, in labor policy, are national. So that means that every nation in Europe has to do its homework to, for instance, increase integration, to create jobs, inclusiveness. But then, of course, the European policies are also very important to continue the development of the single market with all its components, and to thereby contribute to the growth and wealth of the European Union and all its member states. And I think that is possible. There are political differences in the exact measures, but I think there is a great political will to make Europe an area of wealth and growth in the 21st century.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for your time and for your visit and for your good wishes.
Thank you.